So, I guess I'll just sort of tell you the story of the research that I did and kind of why and what it led to. I think to start with, so this title, Difference Which Makes a Difference, which is a quote from Bateson. The full title is brings in neurodiversity and systemic approaches. So it's how to use neurodiversity and systemic approaches to facilitate more helpful conversations about autism. And so to sort of, say that from the start. And that's what a lot of this is going to be about. I would also say that there's no like big sweeping answers. It's more to contribute to a conversation about neurodiversity and social work, and how it could be harnessed, why it's important, and how it can help us sort of reconceptualize autism and support children that are autistic and their parents better. So I think if we start with some definitions, because when we talk about autism, it's a set of symptoms described in a manual. So what do we mean? So this is very much my definition. So autism as a difference in neurological functioning and communication style, a natural variance in human thinking or wiring. This metaphor of wiring comes up a lot, that brings gifts as well as challenges, or I'd say strengths as well as challenges. So in the DSM, the medical model, you'll be familiar with it being defined as sort of persistent difficulties in communication, restricted, repetitive patterns in behaviour. And I think, this is my definition of it, emphasises that it's like a different cognitive style. And then neurodiversity, again, there's a paradigm. So there's this word, what we mean by neurodiversity, this framework for thinking, and then there's also neurodiversity, the movement, the sort of social movement. And I guess, so the point is that it's a conceptual framework which appreciates lots of conditions, and there's more than just this list, depending on where you're standing, how you identify with these things. But conditions like Tourette's, autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, dyscalculia. But it's a way that we process information, a diversity of cognitive style. And again, strengths. Neurodiversity was brought in sort of early 90s. The first use of it was in an article in The Atlantic, and it was as Judy Bloom said, that it was as crucial to the human race as biodiversity. So the fact that there's like diversity in thought means that we have like technology, basically, Silicon Valley, all of that. Anyway, a note about language. What I did want to say is it's important language is really important when we're talking about this. This is all social constructs. Everything that we say here is that language is crucial, but I'm going to completely contradict myself and say it's important to not get stuck on the language, because then you get into a space where you're just debating the language and we kind of miss the point. So I'm saying it's really important, and also kind of let's leave it, if that makes sense. So before I sort of tell you what I read and thought about, the reason I did this topic was I guess lots of people know Frontline, but you do sort of an action research project, master's research, where you interrogate your own practice. And I'd noticed that language around autism and social work, I found it quite surprising. It was still very deficit based. I noticed social workers listing just with no qualification in the box. They just put risks, diagnosis of autism, or dad has ASD, but I'd be like, well, why is it a risk? How is it a risk? Why have you just put it there on a list of negative things and framed it as a risk, a problem? I was noticing this a lot. I think one of the managers I had sort of said something that I was like, oh gosh, that's still what we think about autism. And yes, I wanted to have more helpful conversations that were more helpful to the children and the families, more positive, and I wanted that to trickle out. I wanted it to be sort of relevant for the rest of social work and society. Is that too grand? I don't know. And also I'm neurodivergent myself, so it was sort of a personal agenda there. I was kind of on a bit of a mission, and it's quite jarring when you hear something said about children that you then identify with. And I think I'd sort of empathised with the experience of being misunderstood by services, in the same way that lots of children and parents were being as I entered social work. So what I read and thought about as I started the project was I looked into a history of the social work response to autism. I'll go through this quite quickly though, because it's a bit long. And basically there'd been little therapeutic work historically done by social workers. It's always been sort of a care coordinator role. Autism is in the medical space. We'll leave it to the doctors, and we'll sort of be over here just coordinating that care. Whereas now it's very much like, well, what's your therapeutic approach with the child, with the family? And yeah, how do you work with autism in the system? I then looked into current social worker knowledge and understanding, which was like a bit trickier to get research on, but there are bits, and I've put those at the end. And basically it showed that there's still, like, within the workforce, lots of kind of what I see as quite archaic conceptualizations of it, and the stigma is still there, but social workers are already better than sort of the wider general public at having a more nuanced and broader view of autism, but there's still loads to do. I then looked at how neurodiversity has sort of come into social work. So neurodiversity itself, it's building, it's gathering speed and momentum. There's now a neurodiversity research space where you have neurodivergent researchers doing the research, which is a big principle of neurodiversity. It's, you know, autistic and neurodivergent people speaking for themselves, advocating for themselves, doing the research about themselves, if that makes sense. And so it's yeah, starting to come into social work because it's for like being more well known in society. A lot of it is currently in the literature presented as a challenge for social work, but now I would argue it's very much an opportunity, and it's full of possibilities for social work because it allows us, it's a way to be strengths-based about autism and a way to have a more nuanced and broader view about it. I then looked into kind of therapeutic techniques that work, and this just led me back to where I always want to be, which is systemic approaches. There is a growing research base of systemic techniques, approaches, methods that all kind of are starting to show that they are effective with autistic children and families where there is an autistic person. More about that in a minute. And then I also looked into self-disclosure at work of a neurodivergent or autistic identity, and a lot of that was quite negative. A lot was sort of, well, either do it for very skillfully or don't do it, because there's still a huge social stigma, so be really careful, maybe don't do it. And it kind of, like, I don't know, put the fear of God in me a bit, but you'll see. Okay, so kind of what I came to think about at the end of that was the fact there's a growing research base, the effectiveness of systemic techniques and psychotherapy in helping autistic people. And oh yeah, I think one thing that was key was that neurodiversity lens, a systemic lens, they help you to move between those models of disability, social and medical model. So I think a criticism has always been of neurodiversity that, oh, it sort of neglects the medical model and it denies sort of the severity of the challenges that some people face. But actually what it lets you do is, oh, well, this, when we're in this domain, it's quite helpful to have the medical model because we need to work through the system. And over here, when we're thinking about being strengths-based, it's more helpful to like have a social model. And I guess it doesn't exclude either. It kind of helps you shift between them. I could go into that a lot more, but I know I don't have time. But yeah, and I think everyone will know social and medical model of disability. But maybe we'll come to that later if people aren't sure. So what I did, action research, I suppose I should say first, is practitioner-led research. It's very democratic because like anybody can do it. A practitioner can interrogate their own practice and look into a specific practice dilemma and act and evaluate and do multiple cycles in order to kind of improve their practice. So I'll briefly go through the cycles that I did because I will run out of time. So I looked at using, within a sort of a broad sort of gamut of systemic techniques, I used narrative techniques with the first family, particularly externalization. And a lot of that was sort of reauthoring bits of language. So they were very, so basically the son was autistic and the parents were talking about it in a way that was, they'd be like, he does all this weird stuff, he's mad, he goes crazy, and it was reauthoring those words into, he doesn't do weird stuff, it's different, mad, he's upset, and sort of helping them to use words and language that brought out a less problem saturated story and helped kind of ease relations between them, because they were, everything was less negative, everything was less deficit based. They were starting to kind of be less absolutist in there, this is a bad thing. They were starting to see there was more room for the fact that it was different and there were positives. But I'm really summarising like a lot of stuff here. And so, yeah, that then more broadly challenges a kind of really negative dominant discourse that you'll see everywhere about autism. But yeah, that was just with this family. In the end, they ended up seeking out a diagnosis for their daughter, which was kind of the feedback for me to see that, well, they obviously did benefit from the intervention and from using these narrative techniques. Anyway, cycle 2. Again, I was a more narrative approach rather than techniques. And in this one, I sort of actually just explained neurodiversity paradigm and movement to the mum. She was really worried about her son's future. Well, you know, all she hears about is how it's a problem at school, in the medical space, how this is a problem, we can't sort this out for him. And it was kind of great for her to hear that there's all these positive ways of conceptualizing autism and the way her son was currently presenting at school. And I think what it did was sort of generate new possibilities and stories about the future. So his constant, like, kind of compulsive gaming, he was actually learning loads of languages online, and she couldn't believe that, like, he was able to do this, and it just opened up new possibilities for new stories and positive ones. And so kind of what I found with the families is that they were really open to just sort of shifting how they conceived of autism, and they kind of embraced neurodiversity. They were like, oh, I didn't know about that, that's a good point, I didn't think he does have these strengths, he is amazing at this. And then cycle 3 was where it all got a bit messy. That's when I disclosed my neurodivergent identity with members of staff that were involved in my research, and that went less well. I had like some positive responses within my local authority, this is, and but then had some very, very negative ones that were quite difficult, and like, yeah, that sort of made me think about the findings then that I'll come to. Oh, I haven't put these up. Anyway, the findings. So very, very roughly, narrative therapy approaches and techniques are really, really helpful. So reauthoring things, unique outcomes, externalization techniques. Psychoeducation about neurodiversity really works, just introducing people to the paradigm itself. And this links back to the title of sort of a difference that makes a difference. Putting this new information into the system, a system that's sort of running on negative language and deficit-based discourses about autism, introducing this difference, just kind of a drop of new information that then everything had to reorganize itself around that. And it was quite effective and powerful, I think, maybe. And yeah, most families were quite open to it. But unfortunately, like within the workforce, there seemed to be less so, perhaps less time, very stressed workers. So yeah, the current system seems to be failing many neurodivergent children, families and workers, and there's a need for increased awareness of neurodiversity. And I don't, that sounds really like arrogant, but I think it is happening. I'm seeing it happening. It's just that it needs to happen more. We need to keep the conversations going. And I think what happened to me is that I saw children that I was working with and parents that are autistic as well being shrouded in this problem-saturated narratives and then internalizing this and feeling even worse. And then I found myself in that situation. I found that, you know, it was whilst the families had these like risks, autism, that was happening to me. And the systemic part of me wants to be like, oh, there was isomorphism in the system and I was in the position of the child. And but also it was just quite bad. So to leave things more positively, there's loads of possibilities and opportunities in the fact that we're, as social workers, embracing neurodiversity. So it means adapting to difference in the system, which really fits in with systemic. And also it's part of the social work task as sort of guardians of human rights and advocates for diversity. It's within our task, it's within our gift, it's what we do, and we're well placed to sort of spearhead that change. And also some neurodivergent workers are positioning themselves as this difference which makes the difference, whether they should, whether that's something they should have to do because they're already masking at work, they're already facing multiple challenges, different for every neurodivergent practitioner. But they are doing it. I know of several. I don't know that I had the resilience to do it or to do it well, but I know of lots that are in practice and are doing it, and like, you know, props to them because I couldn't. So what my key message, I guess, is sort of the importance of systemic thinking and systemic practice. So this is sort of like what I was coming to at the end of my research, and the essay I wrote after was systemic approaches and techniques. They're really well suited for interventions with autistic people and within organisations, and systemic practice and thinking also really complements the neurodiversity paradigm. And it's really hard to explain this, and it's kind of better written down, but there's all these ways that systemic and neurodiversity overlap. So they're all about communication, they're, you know, constructed through language, and there's a social justice angle. They're all about change and creating change, and yeah, it's about holding multiple possibilities and stories. And I think, yeah, maybe we should just go to questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I've got further.
Thank you so much. That's brilliant. I'm sorry to cut in there, but where we've got 7 minutes left, and we've got a really interesting question here from Harriet. Harriet, do you want to say your own question, or should I just read it out? It's about how you could introduce less problem-saturated stories into system and techniques used, and she's attempting it with the family at the moment, but she's concerned that she's coming across as naive / unsympathetic to challenges they face as parents. So how could you say a bit more about how you introduce less problem-saturated stories?
I guess with the language you use. And so are you kind of using the language from neurodiversity? Have you spoken to them about neurodiversity? Are you talking in deficits, or are you talking in strengths and possibilities? And you're positioning the problem as outside of the child. It's not the problem isn't the autism, and the problem isn't the child. I guess I'd need to know more about that specific. I guess that's why narrative complements it so well, because it is about language and it's about storytelling. But introducing them to like positive stories about autism, and examples of that which are increasing. I mean, a lot of this is one good side of the internet is that all over social media is like a whole space where this language is like the native language. It's like, you know, I've had to learn it, and I've had to like adapt to it, whereas like for some people they get their diagnosis and come into neurodiversity immediately, and it's natural to them. But I guess it depends on the age of the child, but I would look into narrative approaches and the stories you're telling, the stories the child is hearing, the stories that the parent is perpetuating because it's being perpetuated at meetings. Yeah, what is written in that assessment, what is said at that child in need meeting, is that negative language and negative discourse is being upheld constantly? How can you interrupt that, I guess?
Thank you. We have another question from Sarah Franklin. Although I'm not sure what she says, do you have any advice on how to aid understanding with parents who are EAL, but of very fixed opinion that a diagnosis is needed to be able to fix the problem? And they keep saying they understand what autism is, but then continue with the same approach. They refuse an interpreter, and I'm concerned they do not have an understanding. And I'm not sure what EAL is. So.
English additional language.
Oh.
I guess they're like fixed on getting a diagnosis, but then the diagnosis is helpful too, depending on where you're standing, and it's your relationship to the diagnosis then that becomes. So I feel like if they do want to pursue a diagnosis, then yeah, to support them with that, but then it's about how they then relate to the diagnosis, because it won't be like it won't be an answer to everything. You won't instantly access loads of services, but you could access some. So I guess, do they understand what autism is, but then they continue with the same approach? Oh yeah, so they've got a kind of, I guess then trying to explain to them that this is not an illness or a disease, so it can't be treated with medication. This is a different cognitive style. This is a different, your brain is, like, to use the metaphor of wired differently, not wrong, differently. So yeah, you can't treat something that's not an illness with medication. Like you need a completely different approach, and the problem isn't the person, it's they've got a different style, and the world is set up in this neurotypical way that demands that they have this one way of thinking, and their child doesn't, and they'll probably have loads of strengths and be able to do certain things and think in certain ways and associate everything with everything, but and that's not necessarily like bad. So I guess trying to explain to them that it's not an illness or a disease, it's a different, like, neurological disposition.
Amy Gordon has asked a question, says, thinking about intersectionality of our identities, systemic practice and positive narratives regarding neurodiversity and challenging our language is key. Your research is very clear and inspiring. Thank you. So that's a comment rather than a question.
Oh, thanks, mate. Oh.
One of the things I wanted to say was, in your paper, you state that neurodiversity is as important as biodiversity, and I found that really profound and very thought-provoking. And you kind of reiterate that just now in your response, in that there are many different ways of thinking and being, and it's to be embraced. Would that be correct? Would that be a correct summation of the statement?
Oh yeah, I mean, that's from what was her name? That's from, yeah, Bloom. That's like the first documented use of neurodiversity. So neurodiversity maybe is every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity, for life in general. Oh, 1 second, someone's trying to get in. So I think, 1 second, someone's trying to get into the room that I'm in. Sorry, what was your question? I'm completely distracted.
No, sorry. It was just that I'll just reiterate the statement that about the importance of neurodiversity as it is as biodiversity, and you made the analogy. We've got a few seconds left.
So the fact that, like, if you didn't have difference of thought, you wouldn't have Silicon Valley, you wouldn't have a technological revolution, you wouldn't, that it's, if everybody thought the same, where would we be?
I suppose, and in terms of narratives, that will be a good way to think about positive framing. I'm afraid we've come to the end. It's already 11:30, unbelievably. I want to thank our guest speaker,